She always thought jealousy was a weapon. She never imagined it would summon a king. My name is Lena Vasquez, and I want to tell you something about the night my life split into two halves, the version before the Crimson Lounge and the version after. Before that night, I was the kind of girl who believed she had everything figured out. I had a plan, a carefully constructed, color-coded, absolutely bulletproof plan for how my life was supposed to go. Graduate, build my career, marry Daniel Holt, live happily ever after in the kind of quiet, predictable way that feels safe when you've grown up watching your mother cry over unpaid bills and broken promises. Daniel Holt. Even his name feels like a bad joke now. We dated for 3 years, 3 years of me convincing myself that the cold silences were just his personality, that the way he looked at other women was harmless, that the fact that he had never once told me I was beautiful didn't mean anything, because some men just weren't verbal. I was so good at explaining away his cruelty. I had a whole dictionary of excuses, and I used every single one of them until the Tuesday afternoon he called me from his office and said, very calmly, like he was canceling a dentist appointment, that he didn't think we were working anymore. He had met someone. A colleague. It had been going on for 2 months. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood in my kitchen holding my phone, watching my coffee go cold, thinking about how 3 years of my life had just been reclassified as a mistake by a man who could not even be bothered to end things in person. My best friend Sasha decided the cure for this was dancing. I disagreed. I disagreed loudly and at length and with a detailed list of reasons why going out was a terrible idea when I felt like a deflated balloon version of myself. But Sasha has this way of looking at you, this wide-eyed, ferociously optimistic look that makes you feel like refusing her is a crime against humanity. So I put on the red dress I had bought 6 months ago and never worn, the one that Daniel had looked at and said was a little much, and I let Sasha drag me to the Crimson Lounge on a Friday night. The Crimson Lounge was not the kind of place I normally went. It was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, all deep mahogany and low amber lighting and music that vibrated somewhere in your ribs rather than just your ears. The kind of place where people went to feel like someone. The kind of place where I immediately felt like no one. And then I saw Daniel. He was standing near the bar, laughing, his arm wrapped around a woman who was everything I apparently was not. Tall, effortlessly glamorous, laughing at something he had said like he was the funniest person alive. My stomach dropped so fast I actually gripped Sasha's arm to steady myself. She followed my gaze and her expression hardened. "We are not leaving," she said before I could open my mouth. I wasn't thinking about leaving. I was thinking about making him notice me. I was thinking about making him feel exactly 1/10 of what I had felt standing in my kitchen, watching my coffee go cold. I was thinking, in the way that heartbroken and slightly reckless people sometimes think, that what I needed was to look like I didn't need him at all, and the fastest way to look like you don't need someone is to look like someone else already needs you. I needed a stranger. A convincing one. Someone tall enough and compelling enough that Daniel would look over and feel something crack open in his chest. I didn't think it would be hard to find a man willing to dance with a woman in a red dress on a Friday night. I was scanning the room when I saw him. He was standing near the far wall, slightly apart from the crowd, the way powerful things tend to position themselves when they don't need to compete for attention because attention simply orbits them. He was tall genuinely, almost disorienting tall with dark hair and the kind of bone structure that made you wonder briefly if you were imagining things. He was wearing a dark jacket that fit like it had been made specifically for him, which I suspected it had. And he was looking at nothing in particular with the composed, unhurried expression of someone who had never once in his life felt the need to prove anything to anyone. I had approximately 4 seconds of common sense left, and I used all of them to talk myself out of approaching him. Then, Daniel laughed again, loudly, and I used none of them. I walked across the room with my heart hammering and my chin up, and I stopped in front of the stranger and I said, very quietly, "I know this is strange, but I need a favor. My ex-boyfriend is standing 20 feet behind me, and I need him to think I am completely fine and completely over him, and I was wondering if you would dance with me. Just one song." The man looked at me. He had gray eyes, not the pale washed-out gray that looks cold, but a deep, storm cloud gray that looked like it contained weather. He looked at me for what felt like a very long time. And then he said, yes. He didn't ask questions. He didn't smile in that practiced way that men sometimes smile when they think they're doing you a favor. He simply extended his hand, and I took it, and he led me to the center of the floor, and when his other hand settled at my waist, I became immediately aware of 2 things. First, that he was extraordinarily warm, in the way that a banked fire is warm, a warmth that didn't ask permission, that simply existed and radiated outward. Second, that everyone in the room had just noticed him. Not because he was doing anything, just because he was there. I had wanted Daniel to look. I had not anticipated that looking at this man might rearrange something inside me. We danced for exactly 43 seconds before I made the mistake of looking up. I had been staring at the middle of his chest, which felt like a safe place to put my eyes close enough to look convincing, far enough to avoid the full weight of looking at his face. But 43 seconds in, the music shifted into something slower and he adjusted the angle of his hand at my waist, and I looked up without thinking, and our eyes met. And I immediately understood why I had been avoiding it. There was something in his gaze that was not quite like anything I had encountered before. It was not aggressive. It was not the way some men look at you in bars like they are calculating something, adding up your value in some private mental ledger. This was something else entirely. It was focused. Specifically, entirely, and somewhat disturbingly focused. On me. Like I was the only thing in the room worth looking at, and he had known it before I walked over, and the dancing was simply a formality we were both going through to arrive at something that had already been decided. I looked away first. "My name is Lena," I said, because saying something felt safer than silence. "I know," he replied. I looked back up at him. I had not told him my name. The music was too loud for him to have overheard anyone say it. I was almost certain of both of these things, and yet he said it with such simple, settled certainty I know like it was information he had arrived with rather than received. "How?" I started. He shook his head slightly, not dismissively. More like the question belonged to a different conversation, one we would have later, when there was more time. His hand shifted fractionally at my waist and I lost the thought completely. I became aware, in stages, of what was happening around us. I had come onto this dance floor to be seen. I had positioned myself and my red dress and my borrowed confidence as a message for Daniel to read from across the room. But somewhere in the last 43 seconds the audience I was performing for had shifted. I was no longer thinking about Daniel. I was not thinking about whether he was watching. I was not thinking about the woman he had chosen over me, or the Tuesday phone call, or the 3 years of excuses I had built and then had to dismantle. I was thinking about the temperature of this man's hand through the fabric of my dress. Sasha appeared at the edge of my vision, standing near, watching us with an expression I recognized as her trying very hard not to react to something. She caught my eye and gave me a look that said, very clearly, "I don't know what you've done, but do not stop." I didn't stop. We danced for a second song. I don't remember deciding to. It simply happened, the way things happen when you are not entirely in control of your own logic. Sometime during the second song I became aware that the area around us had cleared slightly, the way crowds instinctively give space to things that seem like they require it. I noticed people watching, not in the way they watch a scene, but in the way they watch something they don't quite understand, cautious, interested. A little reverent, I noticed, with a small detached corner of my brain, that Daniel was watching too. He was standing near the bar now, his arm no longer around the glamorous woman, his expression doing something complicated. I should have felt triumphant. I had wanted this, specifically this. I had walked across the room and asked a stranger to dance with the explicit goal of producing exactly this expression on Daniel's face. Mission accomplished. I should have been satisfied. I felt nothing about Daniel at all. What I felt was the strange, slightly alarming sensation that I was standing at the edge of something very large that I did not have the appropriate context to understand. The second song ended. The stranger I had still not asked his name, which was either very rude or very telling, dropped his hand from my waist and stepped back, and the absence of his warmth was immediate and physical, like stepping out of sunlight into shade. "Thank you," I said. It came out softer than I intended. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "You should know that I don't share." I blinked. I share? He didn't allow. He simply looked at me with those storm cloud eyes, calm and certain, like he had said something perfectly logical, and waited. "I don't," I said. "I'm sorry, I don't know what that means." "You came here tonight to make someone look at you," he said. His voice was low and very even, not unkind. "Factual. I want you to know that the reason he's looking has nothing to do with anything you intended. And I don't share." He walked away before I could respond. I stood in the middle of the dance floor with my heart doing something unprecedented in my chest, and Sasha appeared at my elbow within 4 seconds. "Who," she demanded, "was that?" "I don't know," I said. It was the truth. But it felt, in the way that certain truths feel on the night they become relevant, deeply temporary. He was at the bar. I could see him from where I stood, accepting a glass from the bartender, speaking to a man beside him in a low, unhurried way, not looking at me. But not, I noticed, looking at anything else with any particular interest either. The man beside him leaned close and said something, and the stranger turned very slightly and glanced in my direction, not quickly, not furtively, but with the unhurried precision of someone checking on something that belonged to them. I felt that glance like a hand at my waist. Daniel materialized at my left side. I had almost forgotten about him. "Lena," he said. His voice had a particular texture to it that I recognized, slightly tighter than usual, slightly careful. Jealous, I realized. Actually jealous. I had achieved what I came here to do. It felt like information about someone else's life. "Hey," I said. I was surprised by how unbothered I sounded. He asked who that was. I told him I didn't know. He didn't believe me, which was fair because the two of us had looked like we knew each other very well, in the way that people sometimes look when they are becoming something to each other without permission. Daniel left. Sasha brought me water. I sat at a corner table and tried to locate my common sense, which appeared to have taken the evening off. And then someone set a drink on the table in front of me, something amber and warm-looking, and I looked up, and the stranger was standing there, and he said, "May I?" I said yes. His name was Calum Voss. He told me this in the same way he seemed to do everything without preamble, without simply stating the fact like it was a small piece of information he was temporarily loaning me rather than something I was meant to hold on to. "Calum," I repeated. It sounded like something from another century, something that had been carved rather than spoken. He looked at me. When I said it, just briefly, like the sound of his name in my voice had done something small and specific to him that he hadn't fully anticipated. "And yours is Lena Vasquez," he said. I told you I still hadn't told him my name. I was increasingly certain of this. Which meant he had gotten it somewhere else, and the only people who knew my name in this bar were Sasha. who was currently at the bar talking to a bartender and had not gone near this man, and Daniel, who also had not gone near him, and the absolute limit of all logical explanations was approximately here. "You keep doing that," I said. "Doing what?" "Knowing things you shouldn't know." He turned his glass slowly on the table. He had very precise hands, I noticed. Not the restless kind that fidget or tap. The kind that move only when they mean to. "Would you prefer I pretend otherwise?" he asked. It wasn't sarcastic. It was a genuine question, offered with a kind of patient neutrality that suggested he would actually do it, if I wanted. Pretend not to know. Perform the small social fiction of being a stranger at a bar, meeting another stranger, because that was the story I'd come here expecting to live inside. "No," I said. I surprised myself. He looked at me again, that particular, specific kind of looking. The kind that didn't move around your face cataloging features, but settled on you as a whole and stayed there. It was deeply unsettling, and also, in some basement level of my consciousness that I was choosing not to examine, deeply wanted. Sasha. She sat down across from me, looked at Calum, looked at me, and then performed a small miracle of social grace by introducing herself and beginning a perfectly normal conversation as though there were not about 17 strange things happening simultaneously. She asked Calum what he did. He said he managed some family holdings. She asked what kind. He said various. She asked where he was from. He said originally somewhere further north. Every answer was technically complete and substantively nothing, and he gave each one pleasantly, unhurriedly, without any apparent awareness that he was being opaque. Later, when Calum stepped away to speak to the same man from the bar, a large, quiet man who looked like he had been professionally trained to be invisible but wasn't very good at it, Sasha grabbed my arm. "Lena," she said. "I know," I said. "You don't know," she said. "I've been doing research on my phone for the last 4 minutes, and the man who just walked away from this table is not someone who manages some family holdings in the normal sense. I think he's—" She paused, looking at her phone screen, looking at me, back at the screen. "He's been in business news. There was an acquisition last year, this very large real estate and private equity thing. The name Voss Group comes up, and then the results get very, very what? Quiet," she said, like someone made them quiet. I processed this. Across the room, Calum was speaking to his associate with his back to us, his posture easy and straight, and I watched the associate nod at something he said with the particular quality of a person complying rather than agreeing. He came back and sat down, and looked at me, and something happened in my chest that I was categorizing firmly as adrenaline. We talked for 2 hours. I say talked, he asked questions, and I answered them, and what I remember most about it was how present he seemed when I spoke. Not waiting for his turn. Not looking past me. Actually, specifically there, with me, as though what I was saying was the most relevant thing happening in the world and everything else was periphery. It was intoxicating in a way I hadn't expected. Daniel had spent 3 years looking at me like I was furniture he had grown so accustomed to he no longer saw it. Calum looked at me like I was a problem he wanted to understand, and not because I was a problem, but because understanding things mattered to him, and I had become a thing that mattered. I told him about my job. I was a freelance graphic designer, mostly brand identity work. He asked specific, intelligent questions about it, not politely. Genuinely, he said he had always found the idea of building something visual that carried meaning interesting. He said he had always been better with systems than symbols. I asked what he meant. He thought about it for a moment in a way that felt like he was actually deciding what to say rather than reaching for the easy answer. "I understand how things work together," he said. "Rules, structures, how one thing supports another. But what you do taking something abstract, something a person feels about what they've built, and making it visible, I find that genuinely impressive. I wasn't sure what to do with being called genuinely impressive by a man who looked like that. I said something deflecting and funny, and he smiled a real smile, not polished, slightly reluctant, like it had escaped him before he made the decision to let it, and I felt it happen. Right there, in the middle of a crimson lounge booth, the thing that you feel when someone moves from being a stranger to being something else. The categorical shift. The border crossing. I did not want to feel this. I was supposed to be in recovery. I was supposed to be a cautionary tale about what happens when you invest 3 years in someone who doesn't see you. I was not supposed to be sitting in a bar at midnight feeling border crossings happening in my chest because of a man I had met 2 hours ago under spectacularly unserious circumstances. I excused myself to find the bathroom. I stood at the mirror for a full minute telling myself sensible things. He was a stranger. He was clearly not a simple person. He had known my name before I told it to him. He had said he didn't share, which was a strange and borderline alarming thing for a person to say to someone they'd just met. All of this was true. I went back out and he was still there, and when he saw me come back something in his expression settled, almost imperceptibly, like he had been holding something loosely and had just allowed it to rest. And I sat down, and we kept talking. At one point, Daniel walked past our table. He slowed slightly. Calum did not look at him. Not a glance. Not a flicker. His eyes stayed exactly where they were on me, and the message of that, the sheer composed certainty of it, was louder than anything Daniel had ever said to me in 3 years. He asked to see me again before we left. Not in the way that people usually ask, tentative, angled toward plausible deniability. Directly, the way he seemed to do everything. He said, "I want to see you again, and I would like your number." Not as a question, technically, but with a quality of openness to it that left the choice entirely mine, which felt important somehow. Like he wanted the yes but would not engineer it. I gave it to him. Sasha was quiet for the entire cab ride home, which, if you knew Sasha, told you everything. He texted at 11 the following morning. Not a good morning or a hope last night was fun, or any of the soft, indeterminate opening moves I had learned to interpret as a man deciding whether he was actually interested. Just a time and a place. Sunday, a restaurant near the river. Noon. I replied yes before I finished reading it. And then I spent 48 hours trying to remember who I was when I wasn't in a dimly lit bar with his hand at my waist and his eyes doing that specific, devastating thing. The rational version of myself had a list of concerns. He was clearly wealthy in a way that came with complications. He had known my name from nowhere. He had said things that made no linear sense the I don't share. The settled certainty of his attention. The way the people around him moved with a kind of careful, peripheral awareness of him, like he was something that required monitoring. Sasha's phone research, which had turned up a lot of very clean nothing. These were all data points that a sensible woman would weigh carefully. I was not, as it turned out, currently a sensible woman. Sunday came. I wore something simple, dark grain, the kind of thing that said I made an effort but I am not trying too hard, which was entirely a lie, because I was very much trying. The restaurant was quiet and warm, the kind of place that understood light, and he was already there when I arrived, which I would later learn was always true. He was always already there, always positioned in the corner, back to the wall, facing the door, always the first to see you enter. He stood when I arrived. Old-fashioned. I catalogued it without comment. We ordered. We talked. It was different in daylight, not worse, just more visible. I could see him more clearly, and he could see me, and there was an almost formal quality to the openness of it, like we had both agreed to be honest and were now testing the terms. He asked about my family. I told him I was close with my mother, that she had worked hard and expected the same from me, that I had moved to the city for university and stayed because staying felt like forward motion. I asked about his. He was quiet for a moment. My family is complicated, he said. I didn't push. He told me eventually, in the spare, careful way he told most things, that he was the eldest of several. That there were responsibilities attached to that which he had understood from very young. That there were expectations which had been as much a part of his upbringing as breathing. He said it without bitterness. He said it the way you say something that simply is, that you have so long since absorbed that resentment about it would be like resenting weather. That sounds lonely, I said. He looked at me. It was the third time I had said something that seemed to catch him somewhere specific, somewhere not quite defended. He recovered quickly, the way practiced people do. It was, he said. Occasionally, I wanted to ask him 10 more questions. I asked him none of them. Something told me that the way to reach this man was not to press forward but to hold still. That he was someone who had spent his life reading threats in people's approaches, and that patience was a more interesting thing to offer him than urgency. He walked me to the corner where I caught my train home. We stood on the pavement, and he looked at me for a moment in the thin Sunday afternoon light, and he said, "I'll call you this week. Not I'll text. Not I'll be in touch." He said call, like a person from a century when words meant what they said. He called Thursday. We spoke for an hour. He asked what I was working on, and I described a branding project I was struggling with, and he asked questions about it with such focused interest that I actually solved a design problem I had been stuck on for 2 days somewhere in the middle of explaining it to him. I told him as much, slightly embarrassed. He said sometimes an outside perspective clarifies things. He said it mildly, but I heard something underneath it, the smallest wish, maybe, to be someone's outside perspective, to be let close enough to be useful to someone. I filed that away somewhere careful. He came to my part of the city the following week. We walked. He was different outside, still composed, still self-contained, but marginally less formal, like the city moving around him gave him something to let his attention rest on when eye contact became too direct. We got coffee. We sat on a bench near the water, and I asked him something I had been turning over since the Crimson Lounge. "How did you know my name?" That night. He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding. Deciding, "I recognized you," he said finally. "From where?" I had never met. I was almost certain. He looked at the water, not evasively, like he was arranging something. "There are things about me," he said, "that aren't straightforward to explain, and I am aware that in the absence of explanation, certain things I've said must seem strange." "A little," I said. "I want to explain them," he said. "I want to. But there is an order to how it should be done, and if I do it wrong," he stopped. "Wrong how?" He looked at me. There was something in his expression I hadn't seen before. It wasn't uncertainty, exactly. It was something closer to care. Like he was holding something fragile and trying to decide the safest way to set it down. "I don't want to frighten you," he said. "Before I've had the chance to show you something of who I am beyond the thing that will frighten you." The sensible 48 hours of reasoning I had done came back to me, all the data points. I looked at him for a long moment. "Okay," I said. He turned to look at me. "Okay," I repeated, "I'm not going anywhere. Show me who you are first." Something shifted in his face, not dramatically, a slight easing, like a hand releasing something it had been holding very tightly for a very long time. We sat by the water until it got dark. Things moved slowly and not slowly at the same time. What I mean is that the calendar said 2 weeks, then 3, then a month, and if you asked me to account for the time, I would have said it passed, the way time passes, when you are paying close attention to something in full, strange, densely inhabited days, rather than the thin, skipped-over kind. But the feeling of it was not slow. The feeling was the opposite of slow. The feeling was someone turning up the contrast on everything, so that ordinary Tuesday afternoons had edges, and Calum's voice on the phone at night had weight, and even the hours when he wasn't there had the particular specific texture of waiting for someone, rather than the blurred gray of a life not expecting anyone. He was extraordinarily consistent. I hadn't realized, until I experienced the opposite, how much inconsistency had cost me. Daniel had been unpredictable in the way people are when their interest in you is conditional warm when things were going well, cold when they weren't, and the temperature of it was always somehow connected to something that had nothing to do with you, so you were always off balance. Always adjusting, always trying to figure out which version of him had arrived. Calum was not like this. He did what he said. He called when he said he'd call. He arrived when he said he'd arrive, not because he was performing reliability, but because inconsistency seemed to be genuinely foreign to his nature, as though the idea of saying a thing and not doing it was a category of human behavior he had simply never bothered to adopt. He was also, and I mean this precisely, paying attention to me in a way I did not have a fully developed framework for. He remembered things. Not the large things that people usually remember, he remembered the small things, the throwaway things, the things I said once without emphasis and forgot I'd said. He remembered that I took my coffee a specific way. He remembered the name of the client whose feedback had frustrated me 2 weeks ago. He remembered that I had mentioned my mother's birthday was coming up, and he asked about it a week later in a way that made it clear he had actually thought about it between the mention and the asking. I found this simultaneously wonderful and alarming. The wonderful part was obvious. The alarming part was the growing certainty that whatever this man was doing, he was doing it completely seriously, and I was going to have to decide at some point whether I was capable of being serious back. There were also, still, the things that didn't fit any framework I had, small things. The fact that he never seemed cold, even on properly cold days. A warmth that came off him like something structural rather than circumstantial. The fact that the large, quiet man whose name was Marcus, I had learned was almost always somewhere in the vicinity when we were together, never close enough to intrude but never entirely absent either. The fact that twice now, in busy streets, I had watched people unconsciously part for him without quite seeming to notice they were doing it, like his approach registered somewhere below conscious thought. And then there was the night of the gallery opening. Sasha had been invited to the opening of an art exhibit by someone she was loosely dating, and she had pulled me along, and Calum had joined us because I had mentioned it to him on the phone, and he had said he'd come, and that was simply how it worked now he came. The gallery was crowded and warm. Calum stayed close to me in the way he did in crowded spaces, not possessively, but with a sort of quiet physical awareness that meant he always knew where I was, and I always knew where he was, and this had become, without my consciously deciding it, comfortable. We were looking at a particular piece, a large canvas that was mostly deep blues, something churning and unresolved about it when a man approached Calum from the left. Expensive suit. The sort of practiced smile that meant he was someone who needed to be seen as someone. He greeted Calum by a different name. Not Calum Voss. Another name entirely. Older sounding, formal, like a title more than a name. Calum went very still in the way that still people go more still. Not tense, he was never tense. Not visibly, but there was a shift in the quality of his composure, from its usual settled ease to something deliberate. Chosen, he greeted the man pleasantly. Briefly, the sort of brief that communicates precisely how short the conversation is going. The man got the message, said a few more things, glanced at me with a curiosity he didn't bother to conceal, and moved on. I waited a moment. Different name, I said. He looked at me. The man called you something else. Calum was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was deciding. I was learning his silences, the way you learn different types of— There are certain contexts, he said finally, in which I am referred to differently. I thought about that. A title, I said. He was quiet again. Then, very slightly, he inclined his head. That was the night I stopped collecting data points and started understanding that they were pointing somewhere specific. Somewhere I did not have a rational response to. Somewhere that would require me to receive an impossible thing and choose how to carry it. I did not bring it up again that night. We left the gallery and he walked me home, and at my door he looked at me for a moment with that particular focused attention, and then he said, "Soon." Just that. Soon, like he was promising something, like there was a timeline to the thing he had been waiting, and we were nearing its end, and he wanted me to know it without knowing yet what I was being prepared for. I went inside and stood in my kitchen and thought about 3 things. One was the name the man had used, the other name, the formal one. One was the way Marcus had appeared from nowhere when the man approached, like a current switching on. And one was the look on Calum's face when he'd said soon. Something more complicated. Someone standing at a door they have been walking toward for a very long time, hand on the handle, knowing that opening it changes everything on both sides. I had a feeling that when he finally told me, I was going to believe him. I was not entirely sure I was ready for that. He came to my apartment the following Saturday morning. He had called the night before and asked if he could come by, and I had said yes, and I had spent the intervening hours in the strange, specific suspension of someone who knows that tomorrow is the day the shape of things changes. Not anxious, exactly. Something more like braced. The way you breathe differently before a storm, not because you are afraid of it, but because your body knows what's coming and adjusts. He arrived at 10. He had coffee, real coffee from the good place, 2 blocks over, because he had learned, 3 weeks ago, where I preferred to get it. He set it on my kitchen counter, and then he stood in my small, bright kitchen, with his hands loose at his sides, and he looked at me. And I looked at him, and neither of us said anything for a moment. Then he said, "I need to show you something and explain something, and I need you to let me get through both before you respond." I said, "Okay," he said. "I told you there were things about me that aren't straightforward to explain." He said this carefully, like each word was being placed somewhere specific. He said, "The reason I knew your name before you told me is the same reason that I have not been able to stop thinking about you since the moment you walked across that room toward me. Not because you were beautiful in that red dress, although you were, because something in me recognized you in a way that has nothing to do with logic." I was very still. He said, "What I am about to tell you is going to require you to expand significantly what you believe is possible. And I want you to know that I have not told you this before, not because I didn't trust you, but because the telling changes things irrevocably, and I wanted you to know me to know something real of me before the larger, stranger thing arrived, and made that harder." I said, "You're scaring me slightly." He said, "I know, I'm sorry." Then he said, "I'm not going to disappear after this. I want that to be something you hold on to." He walked to the center of my kitchen. And then the light in the room changed, not dimmed, not flickered, but shifted in some fundamental way that I cannot describe in any language that has ever been used to describe normal things, and Calum was not there anymore. What was there was enormous. A wolf, but the word wolf, the way I had always used it, was entirely insufficient for what stood in my kitchen, because wolves were things I had seen in photographs and nature documentaries, manageable and natural and accounted for. This was something else. Something that had existed in a different register of the world. Silver gray, like his eye, massive, with a stillness to it that was familiar, his stillness, unmistakably, even in this form and eyes that were the same storm cloud gray, watching me with the same patient specificity. I sat down on my kitchen floor. This was not a decision. My legs simply conducted a referendum without me and determined that standing was no longer appropriate given the available information. The wolf, Calum, came and sat in front of me, not rushing, giving me time. The warmth I had always noticed radiated from him in this form even more intensely. It hit me in a wave, that banked fire warmth, and my body responded to it before my brain had any input on the matter, because I had been near this warmth for weeks, and my body had decided it was safe before I had consciously signed off on the decision. We stayed like that for what felt like a long time. Then the light shifted again, and Calum was sitting on my kitchen floor across from me, in his clothes, looking at me with an expression that I can only describe as carefully managed hope. I said the first thing that came to me, which was, "How does that work with your clothes?" Something in his face broke slightly. In the good way that things... He said he honestly wasn't sure how to explain that particular part. I said, "Okay," he said, "okay." I said, "I mean, I have approximately 10,000 questions and my hands are shaking, but, okay. You're a what do you call it? A shifter," he said. "How many of you are there?" "Many," the man at the gallery. "Knew me, yes, from a different context." "The title," I said. "The name he called you." Calum was quiet. I said, "When I met you, I thought you were a person who managed some family holdings." He said, "In a sense." I said, "And in another sense?" He said, "In another sense, I hold a position." "Among my kind." "It is inherited." "Significant." I said, "What kind of significant?" He said, "The kind where I don't usually go to bars alone, and on the night we met I had specifically gone without anyone because I needed 2 hours to be a person rather than a position." I thought about this. I thought about him standing near the far wall, slightly apart from the crowd, and how I had thought that powerful things position themselves where they don't need to compete for attention. I thought about Marcus, who was always somewhere nearby. I thought about the way people moved around him. I said, "You're in charge of something very large." He said, "Yes." I said, "How large?" He said, "Think in terms of structure, governance, many people, many territories, a great deal of responsibility. I am the appropriate word in your language would be king, though that word was developed to describe a different kind of position than the one I hold." I sat on my kitchen floor in the Tuesday morning light and looked at the man I had asked to dance with me 7 weeks ago to make my ex-boyfriend jealous, and I said, "You're a king." He said, "Yes," I said, "and you were in a bar." He said, "Everyone needs 2 hours." I laughed. It surprised both of us. It was slightly unhinged, the laugh pitched a little too high, a little too compressed, but it was genuine, and when it came out of me, some of the white-edged quality of the last 10 minutes softened, and Calum exhaled. Slowly, like something he had been holding was allowed finally to rest. There is a particular kind of processing that happens after impossible things. I have since come to understand that humans near shifters tend to process faster than you'd expect, that something in proximity to them, especially proximity of the sustained and close kind, recalibrates your sense of the possible before you even receive the specific information. My body had been quietly revising its frameworks for weeks. The warmth, the recognition, the way his focus felt less like attention and more like something gravitational. I had been updating, even when I didn't know I was updating, which is perhaps why I did not, after the kitchen floor, do the thing I might have expected of myself 6 months ago. I did not stand up and say, "This is too much, I need to go, please leave." I sat on the floor across from Calum Voss, who was apparently a king, and I said, "Tell me things." He told me things. He told me about the world that existed alongside the one I had lived in my entire life, structured, ancient, organized by laws and territories, and a hierarchy that had existed longer than recorded human history. He told me about shifters, not in the abstract, but specifically how they lived, how they organized, what they valued, why secrecy had been essential for centuries, and how that secrecy was maintained, and what it cost. He told me about his position, the weight of it, the lineage of it, the fact that he had known from childhood that it was coming and had spent his entire life preparing to carry it, and had done so, and the carrying was large and real and occupied most of his interior life. He told me about recognition. This was the part I had been waiting for, without knowing I was waiting for it. He said that among his kind, the sense of recognition I had experienced, the thing I had been cataloging as some combination of chemistry and intuition, had a name and a shape. He said it was not something that happened often. He said it was considered. He searched for the word sacred was close, though that was not quite precise. Consequential. Singular. He said the word for it in his language translated approximately as fated mate, and that among his kind it was taken with a seriousness that was difficult to convey in the idiom of my world, where soulmates were something you said at weddings and meant warmly but not literally. He was using it literally. He said, "I knew who you were when you walked across the room. Not your name. Initially the name came within the first minute, from your friend's earlier mention. But I knew you in the sense that matters, the sense that can't be chosen or refused, and it was," he stopped. Looked at his hands. For the first time since I had met him, he looked something close to uncertain. It was, he said quietly, the most destabilizing experience of my life. He said this like it was something he was slightly embarrassed by, like being destabilized was not something a king was supposed to admit to. I said, "Why didn't you come to me first?" "That night. If you knew." He said, "Because you came to me. You crossed the room under your own momentum, and I had already decided that I would not go toward you before you had any idea what going toward me would mean, that if you came to me it would be because something in you responded, not because I engineered it." I thought about this for a long time. It was the most careful, deliberate kind of patience I had ever heard described. It was also, I was aware, an enormous amount of restraint from someone who, according to everything he had said, experienced that moment of recognition the same way I was experiencing this conversation, as something that rearranged the furniture of reality. I said, "And when I asked you to dance?" He said, "Yes, it took considerable effort not to say more than yes." I said, "You said you don't share." He said, "I know." That was he paused. Poorly timed. I was reacting to seeing the other man near you. "Daniel," I said. He didn't say the name. He simply had the expression of someone who has absorbed information about a person, who has caused damage to someone they care about, and is managing the response with visible effort. I said, "That's an intense reaction for someone you'd known for 43 seconds. He said, "Yes, I'm aware of that." I said, "You're going to have to be patient with me." He said, "Yes," I said, "I mean genuinely patient. I need time to absorb this. All of this. The shifting and the king thing and the fated mate thing. I'm not running. I'm not saying no to whatever this is. But I need time to be a normal human person who processes at a normal human speed." He said, "I know. Take all the time you need," I said, "and I need you to keep being exactly as consistent as you've been. Because I think if you turn into someone different now that everything's out in the open, I will actually find that very difficult." He looked at me steadily. "I will not," he said. "I am the same person who called you on Thursday and asked about your project." I said, "You're a king who called me on Thursday to ask about my graphic design project." He said, "Yes," I said. That's sort of wonderful." Something in his face did the thing it sometimes did, the small, reluctant, slightly surprised quality of a feeling that had escaped before it was given permission to exist. We sat on my kitchen floor for another 20 minutes, and I asked him questions, and he answered them. And the answers were strange and large and required significant mental renovation, but they were also, uniformly, honest. I could feel the honesty of them in some place that was below logic. I had become, it turned out, very good at sensing honesty after 3 years of its absence. By the time we got up off the floor, my legs had gone to sleep and I had more questions than I'd started with, and the world had been permanently rearranged, and Calum made us both toast because he said I looked like I needed to eat something. And I let him. Because I did. The weeks that followed were the strangest and most vivid of my life. Calum was, as promised, patient. He did not push forward faster than I could move. He did not use the weight of what he had told me, the recognition, the fated mate, the centuries of precedent as pressure. He simply continued to be present, continued to call, continued to show up, and gradually the impossible thing became possible. Because impossible things always do when you are given time to walk around them and examine them from different angles and decide that their shape, however strange, is something you can learn to hold. I met Marcus properly. He was, up close, a large, quiet man with an unexpectedly dry sense of humor and the professional manner of someone who had been protecting important things for so long that watchfulness had become indistinguishable from personality. He did not say much to me in our first real conversation, but at the end of it he said, "He's been different since the Crimson Lounge." I thought, "You should know." Not as information, as a thing being offered. I met others, slowly, carefully, on Calum's terms and mine, an inner circle who were, as Marcus was, not simple people marked by the same quality of compressed capability, the same awareness that existed in the parts of the body below the neck. They looked at me with varying degrees of surprise and curiosity. I was, it was clear, not what any of them had expected. Not because I was inadequate, that was not the quality of the looks, but because I was human, and human was apparently a category that carried complexity. I asked Calum about this. He said there were considerations. He said it carefully, the way he said things that were true and also the beginning of a longer conversation. He said that his kind and humans existing in sustained closeness was not simple, that there were elements of what he was that had implications for anyone near him. I said, "What kind of implications?" He said, "Significant ones. Long-term ones." He said, I deserved the full picture before anything went further, and he wanted to give it to me, but he needed me to be prepared for the scope of it. I said, "Tell me." He told me about, not abstractly he had mentioned fated mates, but the specifics of what that meant, what it involved, what it produced in both people, what it asked of the human half when one half was human. This he described in full, and it was large and genuine and required the same kind of quiet sitting with as everything else he had told me. He told me that for a human to fully enter into a bond with a shifter required eventually, not now, not without choice a change, a permanent one. That remaining human alongside someone like him in full bond would not be sustainable over time, the way certain elements cannot indefinitely remain in proximity to others without eventually becoming something combined. He said, "This is the part I have been most careful about reaching, because it is the part where what I want and what you deserve to choose exist in the most tension with each other." I sat with this. I said, "You're telling me this would change who I am." He said, "Not who. What? The who your mind, your heart, your particular way of thinking and caring and building things would remain yours. But the physical reality of you, eventually, yes, over time, with full consent, at a point that is nowhere close to now." I said, "You've known this since the Crimson Lounge." He said, "Yes," I said, "and you came and sat across from me in that bar anyway." He said, "And what was the alternative?" His voice was quiet when he said it, not rhetorical, a genuine question, returned to him by the situation. What was the alternative? Walk away from the recognition, from the thing that happened when I crossed the room to him, from what had grown in the weeks since into something I was increasingly unable to imagine dismantling. I said, "You could have walked away." He said, "No." He said it, simply, with finality and without drama, like a door that had been closed some time ago, and the decision to close it was so settled it no longer required defense. I said, "This is a very large thing to carry." He said, "I know." He said, "You can set it down whenever you choose." He said it in a way that was true. I believed him, that the choosing was real. That the door out existed and was unlocked, but also in a way that communicated, very quietly, what it would cost him if I walked through it. I was not going to walk through it. I had known this, I think, for longer than I was willing to say. Since the kitchen floor, maybe. Since the bench by the water when he'd said soon, and looked like a man standing at the edge of the thing he had been walking toward for a very long time. I had known the way you know things in the body before the mind ratifies them. I said, "I'm not setting it down." He went very still. I said, "I mean it. I'm staying. I have a significant number of ongoing questions, and I expect regular, honest answers to all of them, and I am going to need considerable time before we discuss anything permanent. But I am staying." The expression on his face in that moment was something I will keep for the rest of my life. Not triumph. Nothing so simple as triumph. Something quieter and deeper. Relief, and beneath the relief, something that had been waiting a very long time to be allowed to exist without apology. He reached across the table and put his hand over mine, and the warmth of it went straight through me like it always did, like a key into a lock I had not known was there, and I turned my hand palm up and held on. There was, it turned out, a great deal that came with Calum Voss. I had understood this in the abstract king. Position, responsibility, many people, many territories, but understanding a thing in the abstract and then beginning to experience its texture are very different operations. The texture arrived gradually, in pieces, the way reality tends to deliver large things, not all at once in a wave you can brace for, but in accumulated small moments that you only understand as a pattern when you step back and look at the shape they've made. There were the logistics. Calum had what I could only describe as a compound, a large property well outside the city, managed and inhabited by a significant number of people who were all, in one capacity or another, his, not employees, though that word gestured in the right direction, something older than employees, something between family and court. They had roles, and they had loyalties, and they had the particular interconnected quality of people who have grown up together inside the same walls and carry each other's histories in their bodies. They did not quite know what to do with me, initially, not unkindly. It was more the way people look at a new element, introduced to a system they understand, well, curious, measuring, waiting to see how the chemistry resolves. I had been, for years, someone who moved through the world as a largely self-contained unit, responsible for no one but myself, shaped by no expectations except the ones I constructed. Here I was suddenly in a place where everyone was interconnected, where the smallest thing rippled outward, where my presence and what it meant, what Calum had indicated it meant, was information that reorganized something in how the whole structure sat. I dealt with this by working. It was what I knew how to do. I brought my laptop, and I sat in a corner of one of the large common rooms, and I worked on my projects. And people moved around me, and sometimes spoke to me, and sometimes didn't, and I tried to be a patient, undemanding presence while I figured out the topology of the place. Calum moved through it differently when he was there, not differently than himself, but differently than when we were alone. A kind of extension of himself that widened to cover everything. He made decisions. He listened to people. He resolved things, often with a word or a look, the kind of authority that didn't need volume because it had weight. I watched him from my corner sometimes and tried to reconcile the man who called me on Thursday evenings to ask about my design projects with the man who held in his hands a world I was only beginning to understand. They were the same. This was somehow more remarkable than if they had been separate. He noticed me noticing. He always noticed. He came to sit with me one afternoon when a particularly long decision-making process had concluded, and he looked tired in the specific way that responsible people look tired, not depleted, but wearing. The way carrying things wears on a body even when you are built to carry. I said, "How long have you been doing this?" He said, since I was 22. I said, how old are you? He said, that is a complicated question for someone of my kind. I said, roughly, he said, in human terms, something in the range of what you'd call mid-30s. In lived experience, rather more. I said, and before 22. He said, training, understanding, being prepared. I said, did you ever want something else? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I want what I have. I have always known it would be mine, and I have made my peace with that in a genuine way. But, he paused, there are moments, specific ones, when I am very tired or when something has been difficult for a long time, when I want very badly to be a person rather than a position. Just briefly. He said this quietly. Not asking for anything, just answering honestly, which was what I had asked for and which he had given me, unfailingly, since the kitchen floor. I said, come here. He looked at me. I said, come sit with me properly and don't be a king for 10 minutes. Something in his face did the reluctant smile thing. He moved closer and I arranged myself against him in the way that had become natural over weeks, my shoulder against his chest, his arm around me, the extraordinary warmth of him surrounding me like something structural, and we sat like that in the common room of his enormous, complicated world, and no one interrupted us, and I thought about how this was what I was staying for. Not the impossible things, not the scope of what he was. This, a tired person allowed to rest. He said, into my hair, you know that you are singular. I want you to understand that in the fullest sense. I said, I think I'm beginning to. He tightened his arm slightly. Outside, the evening was deepening, and somewhere in the house something like music had started, low and warm. I could feel his heartbeat under my ear. It was steady, consistent, like him. I said, Calum. He said, yes, I think I'm falling in love with you, and I want you to know that's not easy for me to say. He was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that I began to second-guess myself, which I was apparently still capable of. Then, he said, I have been in love with you since you crossed a room in a red dress to ask a stranger to dance. I said, that's a very long time to not say it. He said, I was working up to it. I said, how long does it take a king to work up to things? He said, apparently about 8 weeks. It was Marcus who told me about Vanessa. He did it in the careful way that loyal people deliver difficult things, not cruelly, but not softened into untruth either. He came to find me one afternoon when Calum was occupied, and he said he thought there was something I should know before I heard it from somewhere less reliable, and he sat across from me with his large, quiet hands on the table and told me that there was a woman. Had been, historically, not a Bond. Marcus was clear on this, emphatic in the way that someone is emphatic when they believe the distinction is important, not recognized, not fated, but chosen, in the way that people choose things when they are trying to fill a space that won't quite be filled, when the absence of what they are supposed to find makes them reach for what is available instead. Her name was Vanessa. She was a shifter, which made things simpler in certain ways. She was beautiful, which I received with the particular flat quality I had learned to deploy around information I needed to process privately. She had been, for several years before the Crimson Lounge, a presence. Not bonded, not claimed in the permanent sense, but adjacent to all of that. Expected, by some. Assumed, by others. Marcus said, I'm telling you this because she has been in contact since it became known that Calum found his fated mate, and because her response to that information has not been what might be called graceful. I said, what does that mean, specifically? He said, she is not someone who concedes easily. I said, does Calum know she's been in contact? He said, yes, he said, and he has handled it. But handling and resolved are not always the same thing, and I thought you deserved to know the full geography. He left, and I sat with the full geography. I had known, in the abstract, that Calum had lived a life before the Crimson Lounge. That a man of his age and position and the particular quality of presence he carried would not have arrived at 30-something having chosen to be entirely alone. I had known this and put it carefully in a drawer marked things that are reasonable. What I had not calculated was the specific texture of finding out, or the specific texture of someone who had expected to occupy a space that I had apparently walked into in a red dress. Calum found me an hour later. He came to the room I had come to think of as mine when I was at the compound, a quiet room at the end of a corridor, with good light and space for my work, and he sat across from me and looked at my face and said, "Marcus told you." I said, "Yes," he said, "I was going to tell you myself. I was finding the right moment." I said, "There isn't really a right moment for that particular piece of information." He said, "No," he said, "I'm sorry." I said, "Don't apologize for your history." He said, "I'm apologizing for not finding the wrong moment sooner." I looked at him. I said, "Is it handled?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Is it actually handled, or is it the kind of handled where it becomes not handled in a few weeks?" He said, "She will not approach you. That is something I have made clear and something she understands the weight of." I said, "And what she expected, what she might have thought the future looked, what she thought, was not based in what I offered. What she assumed was not something I encouraged. I want to be honest with you about that, and I also want to be honest that I understand how the information lands regardless, and that your discomfort with it is legitimate." I said, "I'm not exactly uncomfortable. I'm recalibrating." He said. I said, "I think I'm realizing that being in your world means there are things in it that I have to be sturdy enough to be in proximity to." He said, "Yes, and I will not put you in proximity to things I can prevent. But there will be things I cannot prevent, and I need you to know that when those things arrive, you are not facing them alone." I looked at him for a long moment. He held the look the way he held everything, without flinching, without performance. I said, "She's not a problem you can solve for me. She's a problem I have to decide I'm big enough for." He said, "You are big enough for things considerably larger than this." I said, "You're biased." He said, "I'm accurate." Something shifted in me that afternoon. Not a dramatic shift, not the kind that comes with revelation, the quiet kind, that happens when you realize you have been standing in a place you weren't entirely sure you were allowed to stand, and you decide to stand there anyway. Fully, without hedging, without keeping part of yourself back as an exit strategy. That evening, I told Calum something I had been holding for several days without quite finding the address for. I said, "I know we said we weren't going to talk about permanent things for a long time." He said, "Yes." I said, "I'm not asking to change that. I still need time, and I still have questions, and I am still very much a normal person sitting at the edge of a very large, extraordinary world, trying to figure out where I fit." He said, "Yes," I said, "but I want you to know that I am not in this the small way anymore. Whatever I am doing here, I am doing it in the big way. And that is terrifying, and I am telling you anyway." His face did the thing that I had stopped trying to describe because every description fell short. He put his hand against my face, very carefully, and he said, "I know. I've known for weeks. I have been letting you arrive at it in your own time because arriving at it yourself was the only version of it I wanted." I said, "Has anyone told you that you are an incredibly controlled person?" He said, "Yes, often, and not always as a compliment." I laughed. He laughed too, that real laugh, the reluctant one that looked like it surprised him, and the tension of the afternoon dissolved into the evening. And outside the moon was rising over the compound, and somewhere in the large, warm house people, who had become slowly, incrementally something like family, were living their lives, and I was here, in the middle of all of it, in the exact place I had been moving toward since a Friday night in a red dress, when I walked across a room to ask a stranger to dance. The night everything arrived at its conclusion was not a dramatic night, in the way I had expected dramatic things to arrive. It was quiet. It was a Thursday, which felt appropriate. Thursday was our day. The phone call day, the asking about projects day, the day I had come to associate with the specific warmth of being known by someone who chose to keep knowing you. We were at the compound. Calum had finished a long day of the particular decision-making that went with what he was, and I had finished a project I had been wrestling with for 2 weeks, and we were in the large room that faced the grounds, where the windows went almost to the ceiling, and the evening light came through gold and horizontal and lit the room like something deliberate. He said, "I want to ask you something." I said, "Yes," he said, "not an easy something." I said, "You can ask me anything." He looked at me in the way he had looked at me across a dance floor 9 months ago, specific, settled, a man seeing the thing he recognizes. He said, "I want to know if you are willing to be formally bonded to me." Not now. Not immediately. Not without everything that precedes it being in its proper order and you feeling entirely prepared for what it means. But in the direction of. In the intention of. I said, "You're asking if we're going somewhere." He said, "Yes, and I want the answer to be yours, completely, without any weight from me attached to it." I looked at him. I thought about the crimson lounge and the kitchen floor, and the bench by the water and the compound and all the ordinary, extraordinary, accumulated days between. I thought about the version of me who had stood in her kitchen watching her coffee go cold and thought this is what 3 years becomes. I thought about who I was now, not a different person, but a fuller one, someone who had been shown something large and strange and had decided to walk toward it rather than away, and had found in the walking that she was more capable of largeness than she had understood. I said yes, in the direction of, in the intention of. He exhaled, not dramatically, the way he did everything with precision, with contained depth, with the quality of someone for whom the feeling was large and the expression of it was careful. He said, "There is something else." I said, "There always is with you." He said, "Faded bonds between a shifter and a human, at the point of full formal bonding, require the human to receive the mark." He said this carefully, without evasion, all the information laid out in the way he had laid out every piece of information since the kitchen floor, honestly, fully, with the door I could walk through kept visible and unlocked. I said, "The mark meaning." He said, "A bite. Formal. Intentional. Not the way Max turned you, he stopped." I had told him that story, the logic of how I had come to cross his courtyard on impossible legs, and he had received it with the expression of a man who has been simultaneously appalled and undone by something. Not the way that turns, the way that bonds. Permanently, it would anchor us to each other in the way that faded bonds are meant to be anchored, and it would change the physical reality, over time, as I mentioned. I said, "You mentioned." He said, "I wanted to be sure you remembered." I said, "I remember everything you tell me." He said, "I know." He said, "I know, and I am aware that places a significant responsibility on me to tell you only true things." I said, "Yes, it does." We looked at each other. I said, "I'm not saying yes to that part tonight. That part needs its own time." He said, "I know. I didn't ask." I said, "But I'm not saying no to it either." He said, "I know that too." I said, "You know a lot of things before I say them." He said, "I have come to understand your particular way of arriving at things." He said it warmly, with the small smile. I said, "Is that what you call it?" He said, "It's what I value about it. You don't rush. You think. And when you arrive fully." I said, "I'm arriving." He said, "Yes." He extended his hand, not dramatically, not ceremonially, just extended it, the way you offer your hand to someone you are walking somewhere with. The simplest possible gesture of choosing someone for the distance ahead. I took it. The warmth of him went through me as it always did, through every layer, and I thought about the red dress and the 43 seconds and I thought about how jealousy had been a weapon I reached for on the worst night of my recent life and had somehow become the most accurate thing I had ever aimed. I had aimed it at a stranger. The stranger had turned out to be a king. And the king, it turned out, did not share. But sharing was the wrong word for what he did. What he did was something older than sharing. Something that did not divide but expanded, made space that had not existed before, the way certain presences do not compete with your life but add an entire dimension to it, so that the version of yourself that existed before feels like a sketch, and the version after is the thing drawn in full. I held his hand in the golden Thursday evening light and looked at the life that was assembling itself around me, strange and enormous, and nothing I had planned, and entirely, specifically, mine. And I stayed.